Ghost of Namamugi, and I'm proud to say this is a project the Daiwa Foundation has been slightly involved in from an early stage, in that we helped with a grant to support a workshop or a powwow or something that occurred at CISJAC, the Sainsbury Institute in Norwich. And so this book partly grows out of that. And I must say, I thought when I saw the grant application, I thought it sounded a really interesting project, and I had hoped even to go to Norwich and sort of sit in on the conference, but it was one of those things that just didn't happen. But anyway, the book is now out, and it's by Dr. Robert Fletcher, and he's Associate Professor of Britain and Europe at Warwick University, and he lived in Tokushima for a while. I'm assuming this was as a jet.
It was indeed.
So in Shikoku, and then got his doctorate at Oxford, and he specialises in imperial and global history. And from that point on, I'll leave it to you, Robert.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Books like this accrue enormous numbers of debts, and hopefully the acknowledgements page in the book covers them all. But very quickly, I just want to thank a number of people in particular for helping me achieve this. One is Michael and Marigold Wace. I don't know if they're here. I think they are at the back. Hello. The owners of the Richardson Letters, who are extremely generous in letting me work with them. I want to thank Paul and Susan, who both of whom really encouraged this project at a very early point of contact. And above all, I want to thank Christine, who's been there every step of developing, researching, writing this project. Shortly after noon, on the 15th of August 1863, batteries along the shoreline of Kagoshima, the principal city of Satsuma Han in southwest Kyushu, opened fire on the British squadron in the bay. They caught them at anchor. The flagship Euryalus was soon enveloped in an exchange of fire so intense that old hands likened it to the siege of Sebastopol. Her captain and commander, both standing alongside their admiral, were killed on the bridge by the same shot. And as the ship cleared hurriedly for action and commenced shelling the town, starting a blaze that would rage for days, the band struck up the popular tune, "Oh dear, what can the matter be?" Dear, dear, what can the matter be? Well, it's a fair question. What caused this clash? One of the first between modern Japan and any of the Western powers. And why should we pay it attention? In Japan, this bombardment of Kagoshima, known as the Satsue Senso, the Anglo-Satsuma War, is the subject of scores of histories, novels, TV dramas, and films. It's known too as the explosive conclusion to the infamous Namamugi incident, as retaliation for the murder 11 months before of a young British merchant. Back in September 1862, 4 British subjects had ridden out of the foreign settlement at Yokohama, one of Japan's new treaty ports, and which had only been opened to Western trade 3 years before. Hoping to visit the temples at Kawasaki on a fine Sunday afternoon, the group mounted horses and took to the Tokaido, the high road between Edo and Kyoto. Charles Lennox Richardson, a British merchant visiting from Shanghai, joined the merchants Woodthorpe Clark and William Marshall, and Marshall's cousin, Margaret Borradaile, for this spot of exercise. In the opposite direction that day, the father of the daimyo of Satsuma and the real power in that southwestern domain, Shimazu Hisamitsu, was setting out from Edo with an escort 200 strong. The two parties met at Namamugi, a small and unremarkable fishing village, but within the limits provided for foreign excursions under the treaty. Accounts differ as to what happened next. Richardson's party may have provoked the escort and refused to yield the road. Hisamitsu, who'd spent the last few months struggling to increase his standing in national politics, may have had a particular grudge to bear. But either way, the British party was attacked and wounded as they fled. Marshall and Clark barely made it to safety. Margaret Borradaile rode her horse to within an inch of its life to raise the alarm at Yokohama. Charles Richardson, however, was seen to receive a number of blows before falling from his horse at the roadside. His body was recovered later that day. Now in Japan, this Namamugi incident, the Namamugi Jiken, is remembered as a pivotal moment in the mid-19th century reopening of the country. Richardson is practically a household name, and the whole story forms part of a resilient narrative of national modernization and the road to the Meiji Restoration, told often and with great consistency. Richardson's death, the story goes, brought swift retribution at Kagoshima, where the sheer destruction wrought by the Navy convinced the Shimazu clan, the vanguard of the Meiji Restoration, of the futility of resisting Western trade and ideas, and of the need to drive forward a radical transformation of political power. In 2006, that narrative was even inscribed on the very grave of Richardson himself. "This is the tomb of the victim of Namamugi," the new inscription now reads, "on whom our country's modernization is established." That's how this story is usually told. Yet for all the attention paid to Namamugi, to Kagoshima, and to Richardson himself, I felt there were real gaps in our understanding of all three. Part of what I wanted to do with this book was to ask other questions of this rich historical material, questions about the place of Japan in the Victorian imagination, about the conduct of British gunboat diplomacy, and about the controversy, far greater than you might expect, all this provoked back in Britain. Nor was it simply a case of asking new questions of the material. There was also more material waiting to come to light. Between 1853 and 1862, Richardson, as a young man finding his way in another treaty port, Shanghai, had maintained a private correspondence with his family back in England. These letters, which had been carefully passed down through his family, were little known to scholars and had never before been published. Yet they covered a decade of immense change in Britain's commercial and political activities in East Asia. They described Richardson's first encounters with maritime China, his efforts to comprehend treaty port life, and the ebb and flow of mercantile opportunity. They reveal his thoughts on world events, his yearning for everyday news from home, and his hopes, ambitions, and frustrations as a young man and as a merchant. The last letter home from Yokohama was sent just days before his death. Historians' assessments of what exactly transpired that day on the Tokaido are often built upon judgments of Richardson's character, yet we've never before had the chance to hear from Richardson himself. So tonight, I want to share with you briefly just three of the things that I wanted to do by revisiting the Namamugi story and with this book, to consider how exactly the death of an Englishman actually led to the destruction of a Japanese city, to take stock of what we really know about Charles Lennox Richardson, and to ask why this story has proved so fascinating to audiences, remembered, recalled, and repackaged in a whole range of different contexts over the past 150 years. Above all, though, I wanted to give you a sense of how Richardson's letters offer each of us a glimpse into the life of a man thus far known to history only for his death. Let's start, though, back in Yokohama, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 14th of September 1862, just as Margaret Borradaile on a blood-flecked horse is galloping back into the foreign settlement. News of the attack came amidst what was already being seen by the Yokohama foreign merchants as an existential threat to their presence and activities. Trade was slack, having fallen short of optimistic early projections. Official obstruction and harassment was working to restrict supplies of silk and tea. Earlier that month, the newly arrived British chargé d'affaires, Colonel Edward Neal, had caused local outcry when he'd agreed to Japanese requests to delay the promised opening of more ports to Western trade. Just days before Richardson's fateful ride, the new weekly paper, the Japan Herald, was again lamenting the prospects for trade. "We fear we have been deceived. Our hopes are proving illusions. the progress we looked for is changed to retrogression. In Yokohama, the merchants began to hope for some kind of crisis to transform their position. Some Harry Parks to get our political relations into confusion, they wrote, a reference to the British diplomat who had accompanied the army in the recently concluded Second Opium War with China. Some Admiral Seymour, another Opium War reference, to stir them up with shot and shell. For the merchants to achieve the change they desired, they would need to seek out sympathetic voices beyond their locality, perhaps in Shanghai, perhaps back in London. But London was a long way off. The mail could take 2.5 months, and without a crisis to catch London's eye, many felt the home government knew and cared little about Japan, especially when compared to the greater commercial prospect of China. The Namamugi affair provided a chance to change all that, even as it deepened the rifts between foreign, especially British merchants, and their diplomatic representatives. As word of the attack came in, parties of British merchants rushed out along the Tokaido in the hope of seizing the attackers. They were joined by the British consul, Francis Howard Vyse, aggressive, headstrong, rebellious. He'd later, by the way, be dismissed from government service for having excavated Ainu bones and sending them back to England. But they all set out now in defiance of instructions from Vyse's superior, Colonel Neil, that they remain in the settlement. Even the British consular guard were swept up in the moment, refusing Neil's calls to return to Yokohama. Essentially, at this moment of crisis, Neil's authority over his subordinates had slipped away, and the Yokohama merchant community seized the initiative. Having found Richardson's body at the roadside, the merchants reconvened, and as a series of meetings held throughout the night vented their frustration at Neil's timid response, set down their lack of confidence in his leadership in a collective letter to London, and pointedly contrasted his apparent inaction, even cowardice, with that of Vyse. The next morning, at another emergency meeting, Neil eventually succeeded in talking the merchants down from effecting immediate reprisals, promising instead to seek fresh instructions from London. But the race was now on to control the narrative, to convince London to take their side in this dispute. And in this, the question of who Richardson was, the character of the man, really mattered. It was no mere question of biographical interest. It got to the heart of why the Namamugi incident divided opinion, British and Japanese, at the time and ever since. For an air of mystery surrounded precisely what had happened that September day on the Tokaido. Subtly different interpretations had circulated from the outset in the survivors' witness statements and the coroner's report. When the news broke in Britain, and as public opinion debated how best to respond, these differences were amplified into divergent representations of Richardson's character and behaviour. In Parliament and in print, as a vast range of opinions on British conduct in Asia latched on to the person of the unfortunate Mr. Richardson, his death was restaged to suit a multiplicity of positions and arguments. For champions of British overseas trade, urging armed intervention to meet this latest outrage, Richardson was naturally a man of unblemished character. If the advocates of intervention were to build a convincing case, it would need to be on behalf of a man above reproach. And so, immediately after Richardson was laid to rest, Yokohama's foreign merchants set to work, getting their version of events into circulation along the China coast. Within days, the Herald was offering readers a poignant sketch of this fine and manly specimen of a young Englishman. Richardson's excellent qualities, both of head and heart, with his gentle manner and chivalrous disposition, were concealed under a quiet exterior. Only a few days before his death, the paper went on, Richardson had been telling a friend, sadly unnamed, that it was with great satisfaction to think that he had left Shanghai without leaving a single disagreeable reminiscence with any member of the community. It's hard to know how well known Richardson really was in the Yokohama settlement. He'd arrived there just a few weeks before, but the foreign community wasn't large, and some do seem to have remembered him fondly from their earlier Shanghai days. Either way, here was a picture of a man with unimpeachable character. On that fateful day, the story went, Richardson had behaved with characteristic sensitivity, innocence, and chivalry. Some accounts stress that he'd been struck while attempting to protect Margaret Borradaile from harm. William Marshall's inquest testimony was particularly important in absolving the foreigners of any blame in the incident. "We did not go faster than a walking pace," he said, "nor did anything else whatever to give offence. When Richardson found the way ahead barred by the procession, he reportedly turned in his saddle," and here I quote Marshall's testimony again, "looked back and he said, 'We are stopped.' Clark said, 'Don't go on, we can turn into a side road.' I, Marshall, said, 'For God's sake, let us have no row.' Our horses were quietly being turned around when Richardson was struck." If Richardson was blameless in this version of events, then Hisamitsu was a cruel wretch. His name remained a byword among foreigners for years. Whenever it appeared in the Herald, which, given Satsuma's rising national prominence, was often, it was as the old villain, or worse. Such accounts were also the most likely to stress the alleged mutilation of Richardson's body. 2 weeks after the murder, Howard Vyse had revisited Namamugi to investigate rumours that Richardson had been hacked as he lay wounded at the roadside. This seems to have been a misunderstanding of the samurai's actions, who had acted to end the suffering of a mortally wounded man. But Vyse's evidence made for gruesome reading and was widely reported. For some, it made this not a murder at all, but butchery worthy of North American Indians, whereby the Japanese had forfeit any right to be considered civilized. Now in the book, I argued that the image of Richardson as a martyr for the cause of free trade was critical to building momentum behind the case for armed intervention. Men like Richardson, who had responded to the call and come here as pioneers of trade and civilization, should not, one paper editorialized, be abandoned to assassination or driven out by threats until our trade is annihilated and our prestige destroyed. Japan now became associated with the deliberate confinement of British commerce and civilization to narrow, precarious coastal enclaves, a powerful motif of press coverage from the First Opium War. But others were prepared to offer a very different reading of Richardson and of events at Namamugi. Critics of empire and of Palmerston's foreign policy, who blamed an arrogant Charles Richardson for the disrespect he must surely have shown Hisamitsu's procession. Strangely, most of these contrary interpretations seem to have been drawn from the same initial reports. No one yet sought to provide greater details about Richardson's background or even his career. And yet that trickle of criticism became a flood after word of the extent of destruction at Kagoshima reached Britain late in October 1863. Initial reports suggested that the entire town had caught fire. The rumour circulated, quite erroneously, that tens of thousands had perished in the blaze, and the outrage this provoked fueled a much darker image of Charles Richardson, an avatar of merchant belligerence and cupidity with no defensible claim to the support of the state. Richardson, not Hisamitsu, was the real villain of the piece. This debate, I think, seldom receives the attention it deserves, and was one of the things I really wanted to achieve in writing this book. While we know much about the impact of the bombardment on Satsuma and in Japanese politics of the period, British historians have tended to pass over its impact at home. But that's a mistake, for tracing its reverberations in all their complexity enriches our understanding of the real anxieties that surrounded Britain's place in the world, even at the supposed height of its influence and power. Some argued that Japan had attained a sufficient level of civilization that it was simply not an eligible candidate for the methods of gunboat diplomacy. Others attacked the government for having forced the commercial treaties on Japan in the first place, in the teeth of all their strongest prejudices and in defiance of their traditional policy. As yet another of Britain's semi-wars of the period, it compounded a wider feeling among the mid-Victorians, what with war in the Crimea, Italy, Southern Africa, New Zealand, mutiny in India, civil war in the United States, that international affairs were in crisis. And Richardson came up often in this debate. So much destruction, fresh entanglement on the edge of empire, all to avenge the death of one Englishman. In fact, a second Charles Richardson emerged from the ashes of Kagoshima. Haughty, headstrong and disrespectful, he not only personifies the myriad faults of British merchants in Asia, but confirms the illegitimacy of using force on their behalf. For the sternest critics, Richardson had brought the attack on himself. If he was a victim, it was merely of the enmity inspired by our insolence. Merchants were well known for holding native custom in contempt, and it was, one newspaper wrote, owing undoubtedly to this dogged, defiant, unaccommodating obstinacy that the party to which the unfortunate Mr. Richardson belonged brought their own lives into peril. The future Lord Salisbury similarly found Richardson guilty of an act of incaution in failing to get off the road altogether. Either he did not know the etiquette, Salisbury concluded, or he determined to assert his rights as a true-born Briton and to disregard it. But the strongest criticism came from Britain's ranking official in Shanghai, Sir Frederick Bruce, a man who was no stranger to locking horns with the merchants there. In a letter to the Foreign Secretary, lambasting the swaggering conceit with which British merchants went about their business in Asia, Bruce described how he had had to punish Richardson some years previously for an unprovoked assault on a Chinese servant. He was, Bruce wrote, of a type too often found among our middle class, with the brutal courage of a prize fighter unimpeded by a single chivalrous instinct. The instincts of these men are developed among the debasing incidents of a life in the East. They acquire a taste for inflicting suffering by practicing it upon people who don't resist. This is not an exaggerated picture, he concluded. It is what is constantly seen at the ports. So, which was it? The malcontent or the martyr? In a sense, neither, or both. This is the historical Richardson. And most of what's been written about him at the time and ever since has been written, of course, by people who didn't really care to know him at all. For all that we have on him, it is strangely superficial. Beyond the thin biographical details sketched out by the Treaty Port Press, no more rounded picture of the man emerged. And this has remained true down to the present day, so that Richardson remains better known as a casualty than as a man, alluded to rather than studied. His place in history seems so sure, we often think we know him better than we really do. And that's what these letters, what this book, I hope, allows us to put right. Now, part of me doesn't want to give the game away, to give you the chance to discover Richardson for yourselves. One of the most enjoyable parts of this project of editing and preparing the letters for publication has been seeing how different reviewers, proofreaders, colleagues, and friends have all reacted to the letters in very different ways, and seeing what they notice and what they remember as they finally meet this figure for the first time. But I recognise that you've all come out tonight negotiating the transport difficulties as well. It's only right then that I give you my take on it as well. In all things, I think we must remember that Richardson was young. Born in Hackney in 1833, he was 19 when he set sail for China. Touchingly, one of the letters home asks for a longer coat to be sent out as he's still growing. The family had some experience in trade. His grandfather had captained merchant vessels. His uncle, John Lennox, was already trading silk from Shanghai. And it was through his office that the young Charles Richardson was introduced to treaty port life. A multitude of hopes and ambitions must have informed Richardson's decision to go to China, but one reason cuts through clearly. His parents and his sisters, his 3 sisters, needed the money, and there was money to be made in Shanghai. "As long as I have it in my power," he wrote to reassure his sister Agnes shortly before setting out, "it shall never be said that Charles Lennox Richardson let his own immediate family want any creature comforts." Richardson's father seems to have been a particular liability. As the recipient of most of the letters he sent back from China, his debts and regular requests for assistance form a recurrent worry across 10 years of correspondence. Shanghai presented a chance to change all that. "Just let me get afloat and settled in China," Richardson promised his sister on the eve of departure, "and we will see what we can do in the way of making him, father, comfortable. We will show the people how to go ahead. My prospects every day dawn brighter and brighter." Yet Richardson's China was a place convulsed by civil war. Violence, dislocation, and political turmoil formed the backdrop to his time at Shanghai, as the small foreign settlement, the old city, and its hinterland were rocked by the forces historians would later call the Taiping Rebellion. "I wonder if this unfortunate country is ever going to see peace again," Richardson wrote home in 1860. "The whole 7 years I've been out here, there's always been some infernal row going to take place somewhere." In the winter of his first year, 1853, Richardson joined much of the foreign community to watch Qing and rebel armies trade cannon fire and battle for control of the city. "You could feel the heat while standing on English ground," he told his father. Richardson may have started out as an assistant in his uncle's office, but he threw himself into new plans for the settlement's defence. His name appears regularly in the meetings of landholders drawing up schemes to fortify the settlement and patrol its streets. A British volunteer corps was formed in April 1853, and Richardson was there in its ranks in one of its first shooting incidents, a skirmish with Qing troops that November that left 7 dead. "They are a most confounded set of cowards," he wrote home. "They got it pretty smartly." The following April, he took part in a long-remembered attack on Qing camps outside the foreign settlement, an act which, the North China Herald conceded, may be variously estimated as unprecedented, violent, or illegal. All we contend for is that it had become necessary. And Richardson was one of 6 volunteers tasked with holding a bridge on the line of retreat. "Hot work and no mistake," he remembered. "From the way the shot was flying, it was a perfect miracle that more of us did not lose the chance of seeing England again." Indeed, the volunteer corps and subsequent defence committees seem to have been a big part of Richardson's life in Shanghai, joining the new cavalry troop on its formation in 1861 and standing night guard on the barricades in his final months in the settlement. A few of my thoughts then about this violent introduction to treaty port life. The first is the great resentment Richardson felt towards any attempt by the Chinese or his own consular officials to shut up his fellow merchants within the settlement's walls. A powerful sensitivity to confinement, of course, that had been a rallying cry for the China-British since the First Opium War. Richardson's very first letter home from Shanghai addressed this issue. Stopping at Canton on the way out, he found it a miserably confined place where the Europeans have only a sort of garden they can go into to take exercise, and if you should happen to get outside the wall of the city, it's a great chance that you never get back again. Here, Shanghai, thank goodness, he wrote, it is quite a different story. And Richardson's more martial activities were intended to help keep things that way, to insist on British merchants' rights to move within treaty limits, to claim the space, in a sense, to increase their access to China, its people, and its trade. And doing this, he believed, probably in line with most in the foreign community, ultimately relied on force of arms. So he marched with the volunteers and took part in settlement defence, and wrote home to explain that the British merchant could expect no peace if he was not prepared to fight. That without a clash with European arms every so often, the Chinese were prone to forget their good manners. That, as he put it at the start of what would be his final year in Asia, we are all soldiers here now. The second theme, however, is the quiet assumption of a freedom from real danger that runs through Richardson's descriptions of all this, of the fighting for the city, the night patrols, the manning of the barricades. Now, it's tempting to put this down to bravado, or to a simple desire, quite understandable, not to alarm his family at home. But I think it also formed part of the illusion of security that historians have described as slowly taking hold of British visions of China. The idea of a sense of distance from even quite proximate danger, that the application by the British of even a small amount of force was sufficient to keep grave threats at bay. Richardson's experiences seem to teach him that there was little to fear from superior Chinese numbers, that the Chinese could not shoot, that as the British prepared for the Second Opium War, he would be much surprised if the first thrashing does not put them straight. In hindsight, with the image of Namamugi floating before us, it's hard not to feel that these were unfortunate lessons to learn. For Charles Richardson, of whom, by the way, this is the only known photograph of him alive. For Richardson, letter writing was pleasurable, if exhausting, work. His letters discuss friends and relations, the turmoil in China, and the progress of the Crimean and American civil wars. They also offer a glimpse into the varied commercial life of a Shanghai merchant in the 1850s. Tea, silk, curios from newly opened Japan, part ownership in a steam tug, even trading ornaments looted from the summer palace. A bit of this, a bit of that. At the time of his death, it was common to describe Richardson as a wealthy and successful merchant, and that idea is still reflected in much of the historical writing. The problem with this claim is not that it's necessarily untrue, it's simply that we've never before had the means to examine it. And that's something I set out to do in this book. For Richardson's letters home were far less buoyant. In the mid-1850s, the Crimean War worked to suppress demand for silk. Everything appears to be in a state of stagnation, he wrote. The end of last season sadly crippled me. Even as that war ended, the convulsions of the Taiping Rebellion continued to frustrate Richardson's business at Shanghai. His line in tea, in particular, was lost to more southern ports. Silk picked up a little, but reading his letters home, it's impossible to escape the conclusion that trade was, for Richardson, fretful across the 1850s, giving way to a palpable weariness by the 1860s. What kind friend has been putting it into your head that I am a millionaire? He wrote home at the start of 1862, his final year in China. If such was the case, or even a portion of one, I should not stop in this abominable country long. Now all this mattered because, as Richardson often mentioned in his letters, he only ever intended to stay long enough to restore the family finances. From the beginning, he planned to send regular remittances home, but often struggled to find the means to do so. His record as a merchant then was mixed. What turned things around was property. At some point late in his stay in Shanghai, probably in 1861, Richardson was able to purchase land along the Nanking and Bubbling Well roads. It's not clear where the capital came from. The letters refer to this as a use of mother's money a couple of times, but the gamble paid off. For in the early 1860s, refugees streamed into Shanghai, fleeing a decade of displacement and civil war, and land prices and rents suddenly shot up. Richardson, like most foreign residents and active volunteers, may have had little sympathy with these refugees. The place is crowded with swells from the north, he wrote. Ironically, they provided him with his ticket home. What kind of a man, then, was Charles Lennox Richardson? Devoted to his family, especially to his sisters. Hard-working, if not altogether successful. a keen sportsman who sought to enliven the tedium of settlement life with shooting parties, horse racing, and service in the volunteer corps. But the frequent state of alarm in which he lived also left its mark. His letters show, I think, a hardening attitude to China and its people. And as I describe in more detail in the book, that assault on that Chinese servant in December 1859 stands out. According to press accounts, a party of 4 young gentlemen had taken offence at a servant warming himself before their fire and assaulted him so badly that he was hospitalised. 3 of the men were fined for this. Richardson was fined more heavily. All were threatened with deportation if they did it again. Richardson twice refers to the incident in the correspondence. I'll leave it to the book to give the full details, but he freely admitted what he'd done. The truth is, a man was insolent and I knocked him down, he told his mother. I was the only person to blame for striking the animal. The other men had nothing to do with it. Shanghai had taught Charles Richardson that out here, insult, however small, could never be brooked, and that the most everyday encounters affecting his personal dignity redounded upon British national prestige. Forget tea, or silk, or exotic objects from afar, prestige was the most precious commodity of all. Richardson may have come to hate Shanghai. I am sick of this place, he wrote a year before leaving, but Japan seemed a brighter prospect. When he died, the Japan Herald described Richardson as a visitor to Yokohama on his way home to England, but it seems just as likely that he was actively considering a new second career in Japan. One Kobe merchant later claimed that Richardson had agreed to join William Aspinall's new Japan firm. Aspinall had been a colleague in Shanghai and would also be a pallbearer at Richardson's funeral. In the final years of his Shanghai correspondence, Japan certainly appears as a place of great hope, a new commercial frontier about which people said good things, and a country out of which great things will come, he wrote. He began purchasing Japanese lacquerware and curios, some to trade, but notably some for him and his family to keep. And then there's his description of the place, from the one letter he sent home from Yokohama. It was the finest country I've been in out of England, most magnificent hill and sea scenery. Edo is a most wonderful city. The official quarter would do credit to any Western power. I'll tell you all about these things when we meet. It's been Richardson's fate to die many times down the decades, in different guises and circumstances. He's been variously a hero of free trade, a symbol of chauvinism, and a martyr for modernisation. The final thing I hope to achieve with this book, then, was to reflect on the enduring appeal of this story, why it has so captured imagination. At the time, there was something particularly shocking about the attack. It had played out in broad daylight, in front of a full procession of witnesses, and in the presence of a known personality, raising hopes that, this time, the perpetrator might be brought to book. Particular features of the bombardment, too, helped it to garner wider attention. The entire British legation had been there to witness it, and it hadn't proved the one-sided affair that images of gunboat diplomacy often convey. The squadron was caught off guard when Satsuma's batteries opened fire and sustained 60 casualties, a troubling outcome that helped to fuel the debate on the rights and wrongs of the action in the first place. The emotions stirred up further ensured that memories of the murder and of the course of British vengeance would echo down the years. In Yokohama, a generation of foreign merchants kept Richardson's memory alive, ready to be invoked in defence of treaty rights, to uphold foreigners' privileges, and to warn officials near and far against complacency. His Yokohama grave became a particular focal point for these commemorative activities. The spot where his body was found became a popular site too, a kind of grisly stop on excursions along the Tokaido in the 1870s and 1880s. By then, the Richardson story was also being embraced as a part of the local history and civic identity of the young port city. In 1874, the head of Tsurumi Shrine, Kurokawa Shozo, on visiting the site of the murder, was surprised to find nothing permanent there to mark its significance. He purchased the land, and in 1883 commissioned a local sculptor to create a stone tablet as a memorial. Today, it stands near a flyover with its back to a brewery. But in the early 20th century, the memorial became an early public site for remembrance of the Bakumatsu and early Meiji periods at Yokohama, and a place for its residents to reflect on the extent of change within their city. By then, too, Satsuma was increasingly involved in shaping wider public memories of the Richardson affair, at one point even talking of erecting its own monument for the victim. That didn't happen, but figures from the domain henceforth actively engaged with the Richardson story, and for multiple purposes. In part, they did so to champion the moral courage and far-sightedness of Satsuma men, and to celebrate their success in the battle. At the same time, establishing a particular interpretation of the affair also aided Satsuma's efforts to consolidate its new, emerging relationship with Britain, and its business relationships in particular. As Satsuma's role in the Meiji Restoration grew, the Richardson story would often be retold to explain the closeness developing between Britain and the southwestern domain, as a strange kind of special shared experience at the beginning of this relationship, to provide a narrative arc through the messy politics of the Bakumatsu era, and above all, to place Satsuma centre stage of the unfolding national story. In the 20th century, the sea changes in the relationship between Britain and Japan furnished plenty of further reasons to revisit this story, whether in the context of the formation and then eclipse of the Anglo-Japanese alliance, or for the author of a 1944 article for Blackwood's magazine, because the day may not be so far distant when another British fleet will attack Japan. Beyond all this, I think the inherent drama of this story and the intrigue over what really happened has made it irresistible to novelists, screenplay writers, and filmmakers alike. It got its due in last year's NHK Tiger drama, Segodon, in which, in a truly bizarre twist of fate, a friend of mine, Noam Katz, actually played the role of Mr. Richardson. In the novels of Shiba Ryotaro, James Clavell, and Yoshimura Akira, Namamugi takes on an almost totemic quality. It's a place where two worlds, two streams of time collide. There is something in the Manichaean nature of this encounter, of two discrete groups travelling in opposite directions, colliding at a quiet spot in the road, that has lent it to being a shorthand for vastly more complex processes of modernisation and historical change. And that, I think, is why we keep coming back to this story, even now in the 150th anniversary of the Meiji Restoration. And that too is what Richardson's letters can do for us. They check our certainties. They throw up new questions. They suggest new gaps in our knowledge, and remind us that the figure at the centre of all this was no archetype, but human. I can't wait to hear what you find in the letters too. Thank you.